and welcome to Courtgames, a Legend of the Five Rings podcast, funded by the Legend of the Five Rings Discord Patreon.
This podcast will focus on the role-playing game stories and lore for Legend of the Five Rings.
I'm Korva.
And I'm Kikita Kaori.
And this week, we're going to be looking at Coastlines. Coastlines of Rokugan, what they're like, inspirations you can take for your games, and ways you can use them.
It's part of our environment series that we're working on. We do have a little bit of news today. There is a competition going on that Courtgames Pod is having for one-page adventures.
I'm certainly looking forward to seeing what the results are going to be.
Well, let's talk Coastlines.
So the main information that we have at the moment in Legend of the Five Rings 5th edition comes from Emerald Empire, Chapter 2, around about page 80. It talks about ports and such like. The coastline varies a lot in Rokugan, so there are a lot of different environments, really. When you say coastlines and environment, there's actually loads of different environments, which I believe you would like to talk about, given your given your geology background.
Well, yes. So when we talk about coastlines, of course, there are lakes, there are rivers, but there's also a very, very long coastline. It's 900 miles in length. Directly, as we've been told by the
book. North to south,
and north to south. And I did study the geomorphology of coastlines while I was in and got my master's degree in it. So I'm kind of like excited about talking about
and there aren't all the kind of there aren't rivers in the middle of mountains that you need to complain about. It almost makes sense.
It mostly almost makes sense. So if you're going to take some real-world analogies, in the south, in Rokugan, you would going to have primarily sandy beaches, and this would be in the Crablands and southern Cranelands, like around the Asahina provinces. There's the Asahina lands and the Yasuki lands extend in a peninsula, and it looks like a spit, which is usually made up of sand that kind of juts out from the coastline. And from the shape of it, it would indicate that the current runs from north to south along the coast of Rokugan, which is totally fine. In the U.S., this equivalent topography would be something along the lines of South Carolina and Georgia and Florida. I don't have a good analogy for it in Europe, but that's would be what it would be in the U.S. Now, in the central part, you have a mountain range that kind of butts along the coast in Cranelands. It keeps the Cranelands quite narrow to the coastline there, and they do talk about the White Cliffs or the cliffs along that area of land. So this is elevated lands. The mountains have raised the lands up and made these cliffs. And it would have topography similar to Dover in the UK, which is an old mountain range. The mountains in that part of Cranelands aren't huge. They're worn, but they're still elevating these coastal cliffs.
Yeah. And it's important to remember that you don't just have people living on the cliffs and looking down at the sea far, far away. You also have communities that are down the bottom of those cliffs, because there will be very often, it won't simply be sea and then this kind of vertical wall. There will be old cliff falls and erosion, and so there will be flatter areas down the bottom. So you will have fishing villages at the bottom of these cliffs. Sometimes you'll have people at the top of the cliff, and there's a way down, and then you have your actual kind of fishing wharves and jetties and piers down the bottom, and all sorts. So there's a lot of variety there.
Right. Even though it's cliffs there, they don't have to be like no fishing villages there. They are going to be there along the bottom, especially for these old mountain cliffs. So in the central north part, you have Otosanuchi, the city of Otosanuchi. And if you just look at the map, the city of Otosanuchi looks like it sits on a river delta. There is a mysterious waterfall that sits in the middle of Otosanuchi. Sapun Hill is there, but the whole way it juts out in the sea, it looks very much like a river delta mouth there. And in the U.S., this would be like Louisiana, but it's in a cooler climate than Louisiana, but still it looks like Louisiana jutting out. So that means there's going to be lots of channels to the sea. It's going to be prone to occasional flooding, at least in the lower income districts, that sort of thing. So go underwater and global warming.
What I was thinking also is that if you look at London, London is on an estuary, and that's not dissimilar. An estuary is basically where, is this a river mouth or is this the ocean? And the answer is kind of
right.
Yes, depending on what the tide's doing. It is kind of one of those two things. So that kind of also makes me think about that, because London has loads and loads of rivers, many of which are built over. If you have elevation changes, then you could end up with weird waterfalls in strange places, springs and such like. But also a particularly high tide, and you're wading, and also you flooding from down. So lots of interesting stuff going on there.
Right. And then in the northern part of Rokugan, you've got this ragged end of this fresh and volcanic mountain range occurring up in Phoenix Lands. And so that's going to be, in Phoenix Lands, it's going to be a very steep, rocky coastline. Similar to Greece or northern Italy. You can have fishing villages. They cling to strips of sand and stuff along the edge of this. It can be quite lovely, but overall the topography is going to be a lot of really up and down steep islands and that sort of thing.
Generally, because fishing is such a good way of making a living, you will find communities, and they will find a way.
Yes, they will.
So, like I've been saying, all these areas are going to be very well inhabited because the ocean is quite fertile. It's a good source of food, and when there's a good source of food, you are going to get loads of people.
Yeah. So
lots of fishing villages, larger kind of port towns where if there's a good access to the interior, either because of the mouth of a river or some other place where you could actually beat a big ship. So there'll be communities of all sizes up and down, all the way up to the imperial capital.
Right. So what are those fishing villages like? And as you said, they can get to any size. They will be generally built around harbors, either naturally created ones or created around a man-made breaker. In Japan, they were perfectly capable of making breakwaters and seawalls to make their own little harbors where the coastline seemed amenable to it. In Rokugan, when you have Earth Shikija running around, it's even easier.
Yeah. Basically, it's essentially building a very large rock wall in one place or another, curved or not curved, or depending on your local resources and population, and how many people have you got, and how long are you willing to take. These things, and some of these things are done over generations, and some of them are done as great big infrastructure projects, which can also, in their own way, form. I mean, don't just think of this as scenery, but these things can also form plots, and there can be all sorts of shenanigans over the village elders and the daimyo having conflicts over how we're going to are we going to do this thing because we think it'd be a really good idea, but I don't want to do it, and so on and so on. There's just so many interesting
right. Absolutely. It's, I'm going to build this spit that's going to mean that I collect sand on this side, which means you don't get the sand on your side, and now your beach washes away and I get a nice beach. That's a totally real life conflict thing.
Yeah. So given the distribution of coastline, as it were, mostly these fishing villages are going to be mantis, phoenix, crane, and crab, because they're the ones who have large amounts of coastline, really. Especially because mantis is not a great clan. So although they will have their fishing villages, you won't have as many or be as big. But those are the ones who really have it. But the unicorn and lion, they do have river shores where much the same applies, and there are also lakes. And the difference between a fishing village on a lake and a fishing village on the ocean can very much just be what kind of fish do you catch.
Yep. So there are 3 kinds of fishing villages or fishing towns that I thought we could talk about. Big cities will have docks and wharves, and then the ocean front itself, at least usually, will be shaped into canals using walls along the sides of the rivers. That reduces the flooding, and especially for an established city that's been there a while, you would channel it into canals so it can flow without flooding your basement. These ones are built for commerce. These cities are built for commerce. They've got lots of warehouses and dry docks. They are primarily used for shipping or construction or trade or military, more than fishing, though fishing would also be done because it's such a great source of food. It's just that so much other stuff is going on that's like almost secondary to the other business. The warehouses can even be built above the river itself. So like a canal or little tributary can have a warehouse built all the way across it and then have pulleys and a hole in the floor to pull up loads and take them straight into the warehouse. There's some really great descriptions of warehouses and river commerce in Poison River.
Yes.
The new L5R book.
Yes. I mean, it comes up a lot, in fact, and is also an example of a port city or a city with a major port that's not on Coastlines, actually up round about Lionish Unicorn Lands, in the city of the Rich Frog.
Yeah, city of the Rich Frog, yeah.
So it's, there's loads of stuff there, loads of inspirations there you can find. You also get the crowded, the right on the coast type fishing village, used when the strip of coast is narrow and the population of the fishing people is kind of high. So near major cities or in the Phoenix Lands, that kind of thing. You're going to get boathouses built right against the water or even over the water, where you have the individual dock that's the first floor, and then the family home is above that. They can be built like very close together, side by side, kind of narrow, because you imagine you're kind of beaching a boat. A boat is long, but it's not very wide. And so you get these long, narrow houses all stacked up next to each other. So it can be very similar to the row houses of the major cities. And we have an example of Ine no Funaya.
Yeah, that's a city in Japan that's a fishing.
Yep. And fish can be taken. You will have a market in that town where fish that were literally brought in 5 minutes ago are now on sale. And so people will come from a little while away, and that's going to be very popular because it's an important source of food.
Yeah, that these villages, they almost look like row houses with the garage on the bottom floor and the home on the top floor, and you just pull your boat right into the garage. It's not dry docked or anything. It's built over the water. And then you live on the second floor above your little boat. And we'll have some cool images in our show notes, but it's not what you normally think of a fishing village, but it works very well for these really tiny, crowded strips of fishing village. There's also stilt houses. So these would be built on broader beaches. They'd be built above the high tide mark, but they're still built on stilts to kind of protect the house from storm surges. They are used when there is more space to build, like sandy beaches. They'd be more common further south. The boats might be quite a long ways from the house because often in these areas, the tide comes in and out along the way. I mean, the tide can go in for a mile sometimes. So these would be, the boats would be drawn up on the beach when not in use, and not right by the house. In these cases, because they're more spread out, they're more isolated, they might be further from any major town. Usually the fish are dried on drying racks, and then the dried fish could be shipped all over the place. You can pickle fish, but it's more resource intensive. You need more barrels. You can't stick them in a...
I think also, if you're in a place where the tide can go in for a mile, that's a mile where you can't grow food. So you're going to be a mile from the nearest actual farming village, as opposed to the ones that are right on the coast, like on a beach, because you could have farming, 100 yards away from the beach, and therefore you're going to have population right there getting fresh fish. If you're right on this kind of these spits of land, and it's quite a ways away from the people who are doing the farming, you're going to need to dry your fish. You're going to have fewer resources because you can't just pick up vegetables in large amounts to pickle things, or the kind of the things you need for pickling. You can't pick that up. So you do the lowest tech preservation method, which is drying your fish. So
and salting.
Yeah. So they have to be much more self-sufficient.
So cool. I mean, those are just different kinds of villages that you can have in your Rokugan. They are all of the same kind.
But you also get different life in each of these different sorts of village, depending on exactly how fishing is done. So you can get... There's net fishing, and there's cormorant fishing, which is kind of fun, and the abalone kind of pearl diving fishing, and all sorts.
There's a lot of stories. I mean, this is a major way of life. This is what so farmers will be planting rice all day, and it's worth knowing how they go about planting rice, and fishers are fishing all day. So there's all different ways to do that. So
think that this all comes down to what do your characters see when they walk into a village? What are the sites around them? What are the activities? If they're staying overnight, or if they're staying for a couple of nights to deal with whatever it is they've been sent to deal with, what are the activities that happen at this time of night? What happens at this time of day? And that can all lead into giving the right atmosphere for a particular game. So gill net fishing, you've got small boats with 3 or 4 people in them. And they're extending chains of nets deep in the water, gill nets, and drag them as they go along to catch fish. So the very expensive nets would be made of linen, but that's high end. They can make very fine nets and net very different fish. But most of them most of them would be made with hemp or rice straw. Which is waranara or nikawara, or palm fiber even, depending on where they live. That's going to be, a big activity in that village is going to be mending and creating nets, because that's how they make their living. They have floats, which are made of paulownia wood for smaller floats, or bamboo for big ones. Probably wouldn't get, modern day, they tend to use glass floats, glass balls, but you probably wouldn't get that at Rokugan. That would be quite expensive. They also have sinkers. So basically you have a floater at the top and a sinker down the bottom, so you have a nice vertical net to catch the fish. And they'd be made out of lead. So they throw them out between these boats. So that's the image you're going to see. You're going to see these lines of boats with networks of nets between them, and kind of rowing and pulling themselves gradually towards shore. And you just have people like throwing nets, they're throwing these circular nets into the water and then dragging them up. And sometimes they use scoop-shaped nets for rivers because of the different geometry of where they are. Yeah, so you're going to see an awful lot of net mending. You're going to see the nets being strung up everywhere for drying and mending and inspection. And then pretty much all the able-bodied folk are going to be heading out to the water, probably dawn and dusk, and high tides.
Yeah, so what they're doing is they're trying to, they're basically making a wall out of nets across the area. And then they are slowly making this wall and dragging it towards the shore and herding all the fish towards the shore and making them more and more densely packed within the area of the net. And then they use these secondary nets to toss them in and catch out, a cone-shaped net full of these fish that they've compacted close together as they've herded them together. So it's pretty cool operation, but it takes a lot of people and a lot of teeny tiny boats. And so if you've ever seen the great wave of that famous woodblock print, it's got these little tiny flat boats with about 6 people on each one, like huddling in this huge wave. Well, those are fishermen.
Yeah, using that kind of, doing that kind of gill net fishing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. In addition, there is cormorant fishing. So cormorant fishing is described very well in Emerald Empire, but basically, fishermen tie a string or wrap a metal band around a cormorant's neck that's tight enough that they can't swallow larger fish, but they can swallow little tiny fish and pieces of fish. So that then when the birds go out and catch fish, they come back to the boat. They are forced to cough up the fish, and then they are fed small pieces of fish as their reward. So they are wild caught. Cormorants are not generally, they're wild caught. They can catch up to 150 fish an hour,
which is impressive.
That's impressive. This kind of fishing is where you're going to find in rivers and in shallow water estuaries, like Earthquake Fish Bay is a shallow water estuary, rather than the sea, because of basically the density of the fish and the fact that in shallower water you can't use gill nets very well. It's too crowded.
Yeah. So in more open waters, you'll see more of the gill nets kind of thing. Yeah.
Right. There's lots of poetry about cormorants. It features in a lot of haiku. They're very noisy and commercial birds, so calling someone a cormorant is a little bit of an insult.
Oh, wow. Now I think I know what the Daidoji call the Yasuki.
Oh, absolutely they would. Absolutely. The fishing there is often done kind of dawn and dusk, where the fish are up and feeding, and the people who are fishing hide themselves from the cormorants while they are out, and then they have some big lanterns to help attract fish to the light, and then the cormorants fish, and then once they've got their gullets full, then the fishermen pop out, and the cormorants come to get their share. Yep.
We have some images of cormorant fishing in our show notes, so you can look through and see some views of traditional cormorant fishing, which is really cool and fun. Other kind of very iconic fishing method and very traditional is the ama pearl divers. Although they don't just go for pearls, they might go for abalone, pearls, lobster, reef shells, different types of edible seaweed, and so on. There's a lot of, so these are basically free divers who go quite deep without any kind of equipment. Very often women, because they're able to handle colder temperatures better, but that can vary from place to place. But the ama are very, very famous, and they can free dive for. I mean, generally, I think they're generally underwater for about a minute, but they can go down for longer depending on exactly what they're looking for and exactly the coastline that they're on, and so on and so on. But that can be their whole working day, 5 to 6 hours a day. I mean, it's incredibly impressive what they're able to do and how long they're able to stay underwater. And this kind of thing, well, surely you'd need like scuba gear and fins, and no, just me and a knife. It's fine. Don't know where you're at.
In the traditional villages, the men, as you said, the women are generally doing it. The men are manning the boats, and basically supporting them. It's very interesting village hierarchy. I think that they're cool. We'll have some show notes for our podcast. You can read more about it.
Yep, and that's going to be places where the fishing might be okay. There's some kind of high value resource. So like pearls, like abalone, that kind of thing. That's where that's going to be worth doing. So
right, it's got to be on a rockier part of the shoreline.
Yeah,
sure.
Yeah.
Let's see. So another kind of fishing or economic industry of these coastline is traditionally whale or shark fishing. So I don't know. For me, this is a sensitive topic because the fact is that there are areas in Japan still doing whaling commercially, and the methods they use are really horrible, and it just totally freaks me out to think about it. So, but to speak about it plainly, prior to the 1500s in Japan, whales and dolphins were consumed. They were considered fish, and they weren't considered any different than any other kind of fish. They were mostly consumed when they grounded themselves. After the 1500s, the harpoon was invented, and harpoon whaling and shark fishing was done. But it was extremely dangerous. The people who were doing it, the whalers, were using the same tiny fishing boats that they were using for fishing, and basically hand-thrown harpoons with ropes. And it was extremely likely to get you killed. In the 1600s, the town of Taiji invented net whaling. And that's kind of what you see if you've ever watched The Cove or anything like that, where whales and dolphins are driven into a bay that is sealed off with nets, and then the whales are killed en masse. However, there are many stories about whales being spirits who protect coastal villages and who drive the fish towards the nets of the fishermen and allow the fishermen to live. There's one fairy tale about how a whale was doing this for centuries. Yeah, they don't have a good idea of a whale's lifespan. And then whalers from outside the village attacked the whale, and the villagers prayed for the whale. And in their prayers and the whale's devotion, the whale came onto the shore and became a rock. And that rock kami, that rock spirit was the whale, and it protected the village forever. Given my sensitivity to the subject, in my Rokugan, I would restrict harpoon fishing to sharks and have it be a very risky and dangerous activity that mantis go about doing in general to get their shark skin armor. In my Rokugan, I'd have the Rokugani see whales and dolphins as benevolent or holy servants of the fortunes, and I wouldn't have whaling unless a whale actually washed up on the beach. But we try and talk about what real life Japan is like too, and your Rokugan can be different.
Yeah, I mean, you could depending on when you can set the kind of your version of Rokugan, whether they've invented that sort of whaling yet and that kind of thing. But yeah, I quite agree. Just go after sharks. No one likes sharks, which we probably.
Well, I like sharks, but they have already established shark skin armor as being a thing, and it does make a great story for very, very risk-taking samurai to go get a shark to make their lord sharkskin armor or something.
So other things that you're going to find on the coast, apart from the various types of fishing village we've already discussed. So we've talked about fishing villages, but there are also going to be lighthouses. And lighthouses are very important because you need to know where the coast is so you don't run aground when you don't want to. So they're going to be towers with some kind of lantern. Most of the time that is going to be fueled by oil, but it's not beyond the possibility that they're going to be occasionally fire kami, where the lighthouse is kept as a shrine and maintained by a lighthouse keeper or a shrine keeper. Those are very often lonely places because the place you want to put a lighthouse is generally near where there are rocks that will eviscerate your boat, and they tend not to be good places for fishing villages or any other sort of village. So they can be very often very, very lonely and isolated, but they're also very important structures that need to be maintained or people are going to get killed. So there's a lot of possibilities for plots and scenery elements there that you can use. I would suspect the ones that are operated by Fire Kami are more likely to be around the big cities, especially anything around Otosan Uchi. That would be, I think, your most likely place. But they are going to be important places regardless.
And all kinds of spooky, interesting things can happen there. There's also, of course, trade. So we talked about trade cities and dry docks a little bit. There's plenty of information about that in Emerald Empire, though, so taking a look at that. But what are some features that you might see? We talked about a few. What are some features that you might see in coastal villages?
Well, one of the more iconic images is those giant torii arches in the water.
They're so pretty.
They are. So you have, the shrine itself is effectively the water or the lake itself. There are also coastal shrines to Hamana, the fortune of fish and generous meals. Daikoku, the fortune of wealth, patron of merchants and farmers. Sujin and Isora, fortune of the sea and the shore. And you also have fortunes of the various winds, the Kaze no Kami. And that's going to depend on which particular winds are most important for that particular village.
Yep. You're also going to see these drying racks of fish or seaweed, barrels for salting and pickling, or just collected salt. You're going to see fish sellers with all kinds of seafood, from squid and octopus, shellfish being sold by villagers wandering around with baskets. You might see like a gigantic tuna.
Some of those got really, really big.
Yeah, for sale. You might even be a samurai sent to get a gigantic tuna. One of my favorite little ideas for a tiny campaign is you are samurai sent to bring a giant live tuna fish to Scorpion Lands because your daimyo needs fresh sashimi for some reason.
That sounds like an interesting, yeah.
Trying to babysit a fish.
Yes. So together with the lighthouses on the rocky outcrops that are going to be near the coast, near villages, and that sort of place, you're also going to have in those cliffs, you're going to have those sea caves, which can have all sorts of interesting secrets above and below the waves, which can range from, hidden treasure. There are going to be, maybe there's a monster there, and that could be living in the cave either the above the water or below the water, and so you may have to start considering how you're going to get into it and how you're going to operate in there and deal with the beastie once you're there, and lots of lovely kind of interesting scenery defined.
So, in addition to like sea caves, another feature you'll find around coastlines is like a really, really narrow paths winding along the cliffside edge, almost over the ocean. With the sheer cliff on one side and the dangerous sea below. So, that's a very interesting setting if you happen to meet a cranky duelist or anybody else. You can have quite the epic duel over who gets right of way on a road that doesn't really let more than one person past at a time.
And in a slightly less kind of fraught kind of scene, you can have broad sandy beaches with kids playing or beach combing for what the last tide threw up, which is a slightly more gentle. And indeed, you can have lone fishermen they had rod and line fishing, and with simple bamboo poles, basically. But that is a common feature along rivers, but also along the shorelines, coastlines.
Absolutely. So, I thought I'd share my very favorite Japanese folktale because it is a coastal folktale, and that is the Legend of Tokoyo, or as it eventually gets mangled into the Legend of Tokyo. So supposedly, the city of Edo was renamed Tokyo after this folktale. So long ago, Tokuyo was the daughter of a samurai, Oribe Shime, who was banished by the emperor to a group of islands off the coast. The emperor was sick, and he blamed Oribe. But Oribe was also in ill health, and his daughter feared that he would not survive out on those isolated islands without someone to take care of him. So she sold everything she had, and she went to look for him. But the fisherman was so afraid of the emperor, they refused to carry her to the islands, for the emperor forbade it. The fisherman would not even speak to her for fear of the emperor's wrath. One evening, she was praying at a shrine to Buddha, and she fell asleep at the shrine. And in the middle of the night, she heard the sound of crying. And she awoke to find a girl struggling with a priest. And the priest was going to push the girl off the cliff there and sacrifice her to the ocean god, who demanded an annual sacrifice. Tokuyo offered to take the girl's place. And she dove into the ocean with a length of rope and a dagger in her teeth. And she swam down to the bottom. And down there, she found a sea cave with a statue of the emperor in it. At first, she was really furious for her father being exiled, and she wanted to destroy the statue. But she thought better of it, and she tied a rope to the statue to pull it to the surface. But when she started to swim back up, she was attacked by a great sea serpent. And Tokyo stabbed the serpent in the eye and then attacked it over and over again until it died. And finally, she made it to the shore, and she and the priest and the girl pulled up the statue, and they carried her and the statue to town. When the statue was retrieved, the emperor got immediately better and realized that his illness must have been from a curse related to the statue. And so he freed Oribe Shime, and the father and daughter were happily reunited in the town, which was eventually named in her honor, Tokyo. So I like that story.
Yeah, I don't know whether the naming thing is all that accurate, because Tokyo, when you actually look at the kanji, it literally is just East Capital. But the legend is a good one anyway, and absolutely is exactly what you'd expect. It's really great. We'd obviously have to talk about it in a coastal episode. So I think it's a fantastic legend that absolutely can be woven into Rokugan. So we want to have a look at what kind of mechanics, which mainly comes from Path of Waves, because you could have someone who comes from a sea, river, or lake region, which will give them a water ring +1, seems appropriate, seafaring +1, and glory 32, which I can only assume is because they have so many interesting seafaring tales.
And it's better than an urban Ronin.
Yeah, clearly, because the if you've grown up on the river, you can have that. And then there was the time when I caught this massive fish, as opposed to the urban is like, well, there's this time I found a really nice tea house. And
I got thrown out of the best tea house.
Absolutely. Whereas, and also you end up with an awareness of trade politics, natural disaster, and the benefits and dangers of the water. You know how to swim or pilot watercraft, and you know the local heroes and folk songs, and awareness of foreign customs, because you are more likely to see someone from a place because you'll have been in a port village when they were there.
Yep. So, in addition to, the real life things and the mechanics of L5R, I couldn't really do an episode. We couldn't really do an episode on Coast without talking about the Ningyo. So, Ningyo are mer people who live in the oceans off the coast of Rokugan. They have silver skin and scales. They are humanoid-ish on their top half. But they do have fangs and long-webbed fingers and fins, so they're not super humanoid. They also have a long fish-like tail. Traditionally, they are considered one of the five elder races, and their element, of course, is associated with the power of water.
Yeah.
Now, none of this we don't necessarily know the origins or much about the five elder races in New 5R. We do see characters or cards in the LCG that show up that are associated with these elder races, but whether they were inhabitants of Earth at one point or inhabitants of Sekaku, we don't really have that kind of background.
Yeah. We've seen the Naga. They have shown up on camera in New 5R, but the Ningyo have not, to my knowledge.
They have shown up. The Ningyo have shown up in New 5R. They are still. One of them became the bride of Shiba, the kami Shiba, and the earlier the Empire, and that still is happening in New 5R. And we talked a little bit about that in our Phoenix episode. Also, their card has shown up.
Yes.
So in the card game.
Yeah.
But so the story I'm going to tell here about the origins of the Ningyo is from Old 5R, which may or may not be true.
Yeah.
In the history of the world, prior to humans coming to the Earth, Jikoku attacked the world, and the five elder races stood together to defeat them. At that time, the Ningyo took shelter in the sea, and they began living in castles beneath the waves and using pearls for magic. A great disaster befell the five elder races. Again, what that disaster might mean in New 5R is kind of meaningless. But the majority of the Ningyo were driven insane by it. They were made feral. They were also made immortal. So you have these Ningyo, for the most part, there are exceptions, are immortal and insane. So there are a lot of legends, and these actually come from real life China and Japan, that eating the flesh of a Ningyo, eating the flesh of a mermaid, will make you immortal too. But you would become cursed if you did so in some terrible, terrible way. And in Old 5R, they had a bunch of different kinds of curses that could happen to you if you ate the flesh of a Ningyo and became immortal by that means. So whether that's true or not, it can make for good plot elements, so why not?
Absolutely. We have some ideas for adventures that might take along the coast, things you can throw at your players.
Because that's why we're here, after all.
Absolutely, yeah. A strange being, part human, part fish, has been seen on the beach. The locals say she demands to speak to a samurai. She has a prophecy for them. But will your players be able to be convinced to listen? And if they hear the prophecy, will they be able to convince anyone to listen to them? And this is taken from the legend of Amabie, and you can find more about that on yokai.com.
Another adventure we kind of touched on is that you can say that the local lord has been called to give a gift of sharkskin armor. And the lord has instructed you, his samurai, to figure out how to go hunt the shark, which is the most dangerous catch. And of course, to get armor for it, it has to be a pretty big shark. If I was going to run something like this, I would definitely run it as a skirmish with a lot of fitness and seafaring checks for balancing on boats while you try and fight a shark. It could be a pretty challenging adventure.
The local pearl divers are refusing to go diving because they claim that there is a monster under the waves, which may be an issue if the local lord very much wants their pearls that they've been getting. So, what could this monster be? Could it be a yokai? Could it be an oni? Could it be a giant octopus? Could it be some other thing? Could it be a rival village trying to sabotage pearl production? Someone's going to have to find out.
Strange sounds have come from the local sea caves, and the samurai must determine why. And if it is a threat, could it be a ghost or smugglers? But in any event, they only have until the tide rises, or they will get trapped in the caves. So the rising of the tide in any of your adventures along the coast can be a big time tension screw, because it gives you 12 hours. You've got 12 hours to be in and out.
Sometimes not even then. Sometimes you have something that the cave is only available at the low end of low tide. So you've maybe only got an hour to get in and get out. I mean, we're not even talking about the tidal land bridge between Crab and Crane Lands, where that's a big issue. You've got only this long to get across, or you're going to be in trouble.
So it's something cool for you to work with as a kind of ticking time bomb, keep the tension high in your campaign.
Conflict arises between a shrine, who is hosting a very important member of the Kuge for an important oceanside ceremony, and the local villagers because of the smell of the drying fish. So somehow the samurai have to negotiate a truce so that the locals don't ruin the ceremony, but the villagers can still keep their livelihood.
Yep. You can have an intrigue for that. Let's see. A ship has been wrecked on the local beach. There is only one body on board, and that body looks like it is a sailor from a faraway land. But there are footsteps leading away from the wreckage. Someone survived. So the samurai need to find out, was someone aboard? Who was aboard? What should be done with them now that they have survived this shipwreck? And it could be anybody from any culture. It could be a Rokugani, but what were they doing there? Maybe they were a Rokugani who had been in a foreign land for a very long time and come back. I mean, the possibilities are endless and could lead to an interesting campaign.
And finally, we're going to end with the fishermen have caught a Ningyo, one of the mer people, in their nets. The Ningyo has been wounded. The samurai must see and determine what they're going to do. Will the Ningyo attack them to get back to the sea? Will a foolish lord look to use this Ningyo for immortality? Is this one of the feral Ningyo who is vicious and dangerous, or one of the few remaining non-feral ones?
So if the Ningyo that was trapped was important, you can have a whole bunch of Ningyo now determined to attack the village to get their companion back. So it could be quite the standoff. Anyway, hopefully that's some ideas for different kinds of adventures that you could have in your coastal setting. I'm hoping in a future podcast we can talk about boats as well, but we certainly used our time today.
Yeah, I think we have that. We have in our show notes, we're going to have lots of links and links to images for all of this for inspiration. So do check that out if you're able.
But I wanted to give a call out to our Courtgames network, including the L5R LCG podcast, our Live from Tokyo podcast called Tokyo of the Five Rings, though they haven't had a new episode for a while, and our two actual play role-playing podcasts, Crimson Gold Agonies and Fortune and Strife, as well as our friends at D20 Radio.
Our content is funded by the Discord community Patreon, which supports our editing costs as well as our website hosting, and that's where we keep things like summaries of our podcasts, RPG tools, and more. For our patrons, we also have special bonus content like Adventure Seeds, early access to our actual play podcasts, bonus podcast content, and more. Online, you can find us at our website at courtgamespod.com. On Twitter, we are twitter.com/courtgamespod, and we are on Patreon at patreon.com/courtgames.
But that is it for us this week. This is Kikita Kaori. May the fortunes favor you.
And I've been Korvar, and until we meet again, keep your jade handy.
Correctly with the correct amount.
D20 Radio, where gamers roll.
www.d20radio.com.